like cards. It's not what you dealt, but how you play it. Play each situation correctly. I remember they used to laugh at a brother.
Welcome back, guys. Welcome back. It's your boy DELRAY, Richardson, platinum artist, platinum songwriter, Straight Game TV. Thank you for tuning in. Hit the subscribe button, the thumbs up notification, or the bell notification if you want to be notified when I drop some of this straight game. I'm going to get right into it. The question comes from a guy by the name of John, and he's from the UK, from Europe. And the question is, what was the climate like when Tupac was convicted? And after the situation involving the police officers and the situation after he was shot at Quad Studios, because they kind of happened simultaneously, if you will, kind of back to back, shortly after each other. And he wanted to know what was the climate at that particular time. And I'm going to be perfectly honest with you, John. At that particular time, Tupac Shakur was considered washed up when he was convicted. And the media, like after we're going to start it from here, because after the police situation in Atlanta, right? After that, Tupac was considered basically a folk hero, from some parts of the community. But then the other side of the community, he was considered a villain. And basically, he had a bullseye on his back. So you got to start with there first and understanding what the climate was like in regards to him. So, on one end, he's considered a folk hero for the people who were anti, police and so on and so forth. Here's a guy who actually stood up, and handled his business accordingly, and, for him, it gave him all of the street credibility in the world at that particular time, but like I said, on the other side, you had people who were like, he's a menace to society. We got to get him off the street. He's influencing these other young guys and who were in the ghettos and so on and so forth. So and then, shortly after that, after he gets off and he's basically acquitted of those charges. Then, shortly after that comes the situation with Ayanna Jackson. Right. And so now, the people who stood on that other side basically were like, got him. We got him, and so, it was unfortunate, but yeah, that's what it was like. And so now you take those two situations and him dealing with that, actually getting out on bail, for that situation, until pending, going to trial. And then so now you have the trial itself, going back and forth to court. It's in the media is talking about it. This is what's happening. This is what's going on. And so once you have that situation, going on, then here comes this thing where, he gets called to the studio. And once he gets called to the studio, while this trial is going on and, this is in the media at that particular time, you were paying attention, you were a fan of Tupac or whatever. Then he gets shot at Quad Studios, and this comes across the airwaves as well as on front pages of newspaper and in magazines and things like that. And so it was like, whoa. And so now people are like, I told you so. I knew something was gonna happen to him because he's X, Y, and Z. And it was kind of like karma they were looking at from the situation and dealing with the off-duty police officers. So people didn't really care about what what happened in regarding to the situation in Atlanta. They just thought that it was karma coming back on Tupac, right? So now going to court for that situation involving the young lady, boom, goes to Quad, he gets shot, and it's like, all of these things are happening, and he's making, media almost every weak, if you will, from that perspective. And then Tupac had so many other charges that he was dealing with, it was just a lot, it was a lot going on. And so now you got those three situations, the police, Ayanna Jackson being shot at the studio back to back. Now you go back to court and now he gets convicted, right? So once he gets convicted, that's like kind of like the nail in the coffin, if you will. We got him. We won't be hearing or seeing him for a while, and so on and so forth. And like I said, when he was in court the same day he got convicted, basically, he tried to get an appeal bond, immediately tried to get an appeal bond. They filed a motion to try to get an appeal bond. He was denied that, right? So now, once he was denied the appeal bond and the bail, trying to get out on in an appeal bond, right? Once he's denied that, now Interscope, the suits, what it seemed like at that particular time is that they weren't dealing with him. You know what I mean? So basically, from the public perspective, he got 4 years. He's washed up. The guy who we know is Tupac. All of this stuff. The thug life and all of that. There's a sigh of relief from a political standpoint. And them dealing with him from that perspective, right? Denied bail. He won't be getting out because he won't be having any bail. He's washed up. That's what the real climate was like in regards to Tupac Shakur at that particular time. It was like out of sight, out of mind. Basically, I wouldn't say that the suits at Interscope and Warner Brothers kind of forgot about him, but most people don't understand that there was nothing that they could do anyway, right? Because he didn't have a bail. He was denied bail. And so he goes to Dannemora, you convicted, and so on and so forth. So, nobody's talking about him at this particular time. Nothing's happening. There's no media coverage of anything. There's really nothing to cover. And, he's just, doing time like every other Joe, every other person. And like I said, when you get behind them bars, you just like anybody else at that particular time. And even worse for him because, it was like he was on this meteoric rise and this crash and burn thing. And people love to see that. You know what I mean? They love to see, they like to see you rise, but they love to see you fall. And so now what changed all of that was Tupac and his artistic ability, right? Because most people, they don't know when you go into the studio. They don't know when you're working on an album. They don't know, when you're doing all of this. You know what I mean? They only get that, like I said, once the record company starts to promote and put ads in magazines at that particular time about when you got something new coming out, right? So most people didn't know about Me Against the World if you weren't close to Tupac and knowing, that he was working on material and so on and so forth. So now, the release of Me Against the World changed everything. It changed everything. Now, the thing that people hated about Tupac, they now had to love about him because when he dropped that album, the album went to #1 and Tupac was in prison. This is unprecedented. It's never happened before. Not only that, but Tupac beat out Bruce Springsteen, a rock and roll legend. This young black male, thug, they considered him, menace to society, the undesirable, you know what I mean? I don't want my son or daughter, and all of those things that you can attach to that. But the people loved him, you know what I mean? Because he was real and he gave you both sides of who he was, good or bad. So now, with the release of Me Against the World, it sold 212,000 copies in the first week. So beating out Bruce Springsteen. So now the suits are interested again. Interscope and Warner Brothers and all of them are like, oh, So now I'm gonna tell you something that most people they couldn't calculate or correlate this with the situation. Interscope seen what the sales had done, right? So basically, most people don't understand this. Once the album started to sell, the money started to come in, and basically they could put up a corporate guarantee based off of the money that was coming in from the sales of Me Against the World. That's why I said Tupac was his own man. And remember, like I said, I mentioned Out the Gutter Records. That was Tupac's label. That album, Me Against the World, was Out the Gutter Records, Interscope. So the money starts to come in. So now they start talking about they couldn't deal with him. Jimmy Iovine and them, they couldn't handle Tupac. They didn't know what to do with him. You know what I mean? And so that's the Suge Knight situation. Hey, Suge, if you can be his manager, if you can get him to agree to, that you could manage him, then we'll put up the money to bail him out. You know what I mean? That'll be your benefit. So that's what happens, right? They're now interested again. Boom, they bail him out. And so most people don't understand when Tupac was in jail for those, 9 months, 10 months, 11 months. Yeah, he was considered, basically, he was washed up. He was washed up. The optics of it and what most people knew at the time. And like I said, once he was denied bail, yeah, it was like, once you deny bail, it's like, yeah, you got to lay down. Ain't no getting out, nothing's happening. But like I said, for him, his artistic ability was the thing that freed him. He was an asset. He was not a liability at that particular time. And I think he was more of a liability to himself, because the money that he was spending on these cases and having to settle these cases, it was doing himself a disservice, if anything. But yeah, John, from the UK at that particular time, with all of the things that were going on, yeah, Tupac was basically considered washed up. It was his own artistic ability that brung him back to life. And as you see, made him the legend that he is today, that we talk about today. And like I said, I'm happy to, consider him a friend. And like I said, to sell 1 million records with him, you know what I mean? But more importantly, at that particular time, yeah, it was a daunting thing. It was, a real dark cloud over who he was and what he had represented at that particular time. But like I said, with Me Against the World, it was really truly him against the world. And it was a phenomenal record with really great records on it. And it went to #1 in the world. Your boy DELRAY, Straight Game.